The starting point about where we are in today's session, what we're all about really is beating the bounds and thinking about today. It's a special lecture or a special session for Ascension Day, and today I am going to be talking about the rural traditions associated with Ascension Day. What are some days, some special days of asking, processions that people would go on in Sutton, and also the importance of where these few periods of days used to sit in terms of the agricultural calendar, and how important it was for the people of Sutton. Now, I'm Jeff Richards. I'm one of the trustees of the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard. We can't meet in the churchyard to ramble at the moment. Social distancing rules would even not permit that, even with the slight relaxation that's starting to take place. But St Nicholas is very much at the heart of Sutton, very much at the heart of the history of Sutton and the culture. And these online sessions, which are taking place in a historic time, do allow us to talk about historic events and try and make sense of some of them. Today we are looking at the tradition of the beating of the bounds and really some of the background to that. And I am enormously grateful for the encouragement that I've received from the Enjoy Sutton and Sutton Civic Society. Enjoy Sutton is the group of businesses and groups that make up the High Street. They do their business in the High Street, very much the pulsing commercial heart of Sutton. And Sutton Civic Society is the civic group or association, that are campaigning and do campaign over matters such as planning and sensitive and special appropriate development of Sutton. They're a very good group to get involved in. If you want to know more about any of the topics I'm going to touch on, and I'm going to touch on things like mention the Civil War and the Reformation, and I'll also mention as well the idea of the idea as well of enclosure. These are all topics that could well be something that you want to explore more, and I would advise you to go to Sutton College and enroll on one of their excellent courses, because they have a range of different things on their history and culture courses, which will help us on our understanding of these topics. Now, I said right at the beginning, today is Ascension Day. This happens to be a detail from a window in St Nicholas. This is actually in the east window. It's the uppermost window. It's representing Jesus ascending to the Father. And there you go. I've told you a little bit about Ascension Day as it is. So you've got, today is a Christian holy day. If you hadn't actually worked out or you didn't know what Ascension Day was, you've got the bit of the word ascend, which means going up. I think in other European languages they have a much clearer approach as to what the day is. For example, in the German language, it is Christi Himmelfahrt, Christ going to heaven day, which I think it brings a little bit more of Ronseal logic to it, a bit like any Ronseal product. It does exactly what it says on the tin, the idea that Jesus is going up to heaven. And in terms of what that meant for our ancestors in Sutton, well, I want to introduce you to this lady. This is Alice Stewart. I will do a session on her and her contemporaries and other people that we know. This is not actually Alice. I don't have a picture of Alice, but this is this is a woman from the 15th century, and Alice was a woman from the 15th century. Her will was dated 1483, and so we actually know quite a bit about her family, how much stuff she owned, and therefore what she did and how she earned her living. And she was quite a prosperous peasant in the 15th century. But G and I've talked about the structure of Sutton before. Let's look at a map. You've got the long stretch of Sutton. This is from this is a map that I showed you, I think, in the previous session. But it shows Sutton Common at the top. It comes down into the line, that line of roads which go from Cheam to Sutton to Carshalton, and then you've got the indicating of the hills as it starts to rise up in the south of the parish onto the downs. Now it's really below the road where the water is. That's where the Bourne is. That's where the streams in Sutton, like the Pill and the Little Pill, rise in Sutton. And it was the central part of Sutton to the north where all the crops were grown. You've got barley and wheat typically were the most important crops for the medieval peasant. There may have been some oats and some rye grown, but they would certainly have had their own little orchards of vegetables and fruits. And a couple of hundred years before Anne, there was even a vineyard in Sutton. So we've got evidence from Churchy's records that Sutton had vineyards. So somebody like Alice Stewart would have shared in the rights to be able to go up onto the common, where perhaps maybe 1 in 10 of the crops, 1 in 10 of the coverage was devoted to peas and beans. You notice that I don't think, yes, there you go, you've even got on this map on the left where it says Bean Hill, so it gives you a sense that whether the beans there refer to the fact that it was the beechwoods and the beech nuts, might have been the pig beans where the pigs could roam, because pigs were probably prolific in what the animals they kept. Although Alice had a cow, she doesn't mention that she had pigs, but she's had sheep, and sheep in Sutton were of special importance in the south of the map that you can see here, because that's where there was no water, so they needed to have animals, so it wasn't suitable for arable, and they needed to have animals that had a light water requirement, and sheep could actually get quite a lot of their water needs from the grass, and also from the man-made dew ponds, which the medieval peasants would have made up on the downs. Now, I want to go back, talking about what today is, Ascension Day. Now, Ascension Day, for Christians believe that this is when Jesus bodily ascended into heaven. And from a Christian perspective, it's as ranked in the same bracket, really, in terms of Good Friday. That's the story of the Passion, the trial and the judicial murder of Jesus, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and then also you have Pentecost as well, which comes after. This is when we think about the giving of the Holy Spirit. But so this is part of the story of Jesus, and Christians believe that this is when, as part of the story of Jesus' death, his resurrection, his ascension, and exaltation at the right hand of God the Father. Now, that is an important foundational element of Christianity, Jesus going to the Father. And because it falls in spring, because Easter falls in spring, it falls, and Ascension Day falls 40 days after Easter Sunday, so it's always on a Thursday. It provides an anchor around which the medieval congregation, medieval Christians, could develop a set of things to express their concerns. This is to do with, never mind the doctrine of Christianity, what's the phenomenon of Christianity? How do Christians live out their faith? And so Christians pray. They have to think about this, and the chief needs of people throughout all time and in all places has always been the assurance of shelter, the home, and food. So people need to be secure in their homes, and they need to know that there's a good harvest coming. Now, because Ascension Day marks the time in which Jesus, the Son of God, is returning to his Father, this became an ideal time to ask God for things. So the Latin verb to ask is rogare, and that became in English rogation days. So these are the days, or the time of asking. These are the days of asking, and the 3 days before Ascension, 3 days, always important in Christianity. Threes are very important. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. 3 days in the tomb, one other. So you've got 3 days running up before Ascension Day for times of asking. And what would happen is that the villagers of Sutton would, and just like villagers all over Europe, would go out with the parish priest, and we know the names of a lot of the parish priests at Sutton, and this would have been even the first parish priest, Nicholas de Heddershaw. So they would have gone out and processed over every part of the parish to ask for a blessing and ensure a good harvest. So these days now in May, we've got the rest of May to look forward to, and then through into June and then into July, are critical for the ripening of the grain, mainly wheat and barley. We need it to ripen and be ready for harvest. There can't be a wind or a rain to flatten it to make it impossible to harvest. The days of asking, these days, the rogation days, then leading up to Ascension days, were really an opening bracket to a period of anxiety before harvest. So these are days in which people would really be, the fields were prepared. We just have to wait now. So these 3 days were the period of days that bracketed Ascension Day through to what would be the 1st of August. That was Llamas, literally loaf mass, which was the old harvest festival, medieval or ancient medieval harvest festival. And peasants in the medieval period feared drought, they feared wind, they feared rain. It was a nightmare to worry about that, because without harvest, there would be no grain, nothing to take to the mill in Carlshorten, and no flour for bread. And if you know the Lord's Prayer, that line, "Give us this day our daily bread," is an existential prayer to give us the things that we need to survive. Give us what we need, assure us of that safety. So taking the people of Sutton, taking the parish priest out, going for a walk, formally processing with all the dignity they could for their little village, taking the banners of the church, going in procession, was a way of, it's like jamming petitions in the pockets of Jesus before he goes up to his Father. They're jamming as much in so that Jesus, when he goes up to God, when he ascends to heaven, that, because there's this repeat of what's happening here, is an ideal time to push up additional prayers through Jesus to God in heaven. And they'd only know whether these prayers were successful come Lammas, when the loaf mass was celebrated and the harvest was marked. Now we know from our friend Alice here that there was also another trigger point within this period, and that falls in July, because the 15th of July is St. Swithin's Day. St. Sutton is in what is, it used to be in the ancient diocese of Winchester. Winchester diocese was huge, and there was an archdeacon of Surrey. And if I come on to the burning of heretics, I'll be mentioning the Archdeacon of Surrey again. But here Alice would have gone on pilgrimage to Winchester. She would know all about St. Swithin, and St. Swithin was an important saint, because if it rained on St. Swithin's Day, then the weather would be wet and they risked a bad harvest. If it was dry on St. Swithin's Day, then they were good for a good time. If I do something for the 15th of July and St. Swithin's Day, I'll also come back to this, because I've talked about traditions in Sutton about the bonny hole, or the bunny hole, and also the story about the Bourne rising, because there's some stories about whether this would be bad for the country. And when springs rise in places where they don't usually rise, sometimes they're called the woe hole. But anyway, St. Swithin's is another marking point in Sutton's medieval mind. But right now we're still back here in these days towards Ascension Day, when all the prayers have been stuffed into Jesus's pocket for him on this day, Ascension Day, to take to heaven. So these are the days of asking, when people would go out processing all over the parish. But as they were going out praying for every part of the parish, they also were understanding what was the parish, what was the manor, what was their home. Security is all about, not only food, but also knowing that you are in a place. This is no sense of alienation. You're not pushed out. You're secure in your home. It's a deep, important need, and rogation is part of that. The processions allowed a peasant to go around and say, "This is mine. This is common to me and to my friends," and that it would be drummed into the minds of every child in the village where the boundaries of the parish were, who had the right to go on to the commons, what right up to gather furze on the downs, what rights existed to turn out pigs onto Bean Hill, onto Ben Hilton. All these rights and duties would have been there. And so the practice grew up, and this practice would vary from place to place, and we do not have a clear picture of what this was in Sutton, but the boys of the parish would typically receive a symbolic beating, and occasionally a real beating, at every boundary marker. And they would also be encouraged to beat the boundary themselves, beating the bounds, so that they remembered where each of the markers of the boundary were. And these were, in Sutton, they would have been willow. Willow grew in abundance along the Pillbrook and around the Driver's Ditch in West Street, where the Bourne rose as well. And because each parish was out during this time beating the bounds, you had conflicts that might arise, because if somebody was thinking that the boundary ran on one side of a ditch, and somebody said, no, it ran on the other side of the ditch, it could become fractious. And in fact, there's examples of conflicts where the men from Morden and the men from Sutton and Carshalton, Sutton and Cushington, very often bracketed together, because they shared the same lord of the manor, would end up in conflict with, physically coming to blows with the men of Morden as they marked out and reminded each other of where their boundaries were. Now, I don't know, we're coming to the end of my ramble. I don't know when the beating of the bands died out. It was certainly outlawed by Parliament during the Commonwealth period. That was a time when a lot of things were squashed. It's unlikely, based on what we know of the priests, that all of them after the Reformation would have continued the tradition. It's a bit sceptical. The beating of the rogation days, the time of asking, although they involve processions, which typically the church considered to be a very vain practice and without benefit, it had no spiritual benefit. Nevertheless, it was prayers to Jesus, who was going to his Father. So it wasn't like a normal saint's day. These were, you could legitimately say, but we were praying with Jesus. We're going round every part of our parish, praying with Jesus for our community. And it's what, Christians do still today. But it may have petered out after the Reformation, further hit a blow at the time of the Commonwealth, and it probably didn't survive people like the early days of the enclosure, because you had people, lords of the manor, who had no ties. They had come from merchant families. They weren't agricultural, and the priests that they appointed, people like William Stevens, he was so Protestant. I just don't think that he would have done that. It wasn't the sort of thing that I think he did. So it may have died out in the early modern period, but certainly by the time enclosures took place, it would have gone. Now, there's lots of things that I could have talked about, which I've excluded and I've not made time for. Things like the tithe barn and the agricultural system, which saw things coming in. I may want to go back and talk more about the medieval period, especially the time of Alice Stuart, because we know quite a bit about her and her contemporaries. That's it. I have intended to inform, to educate, and hopefully entertain you on this ramble. I do hope that you've enjoyed listening to the stories. If you want to know more about local history, then please do check out the history and culture classes of Sutton College, and do comment, do let me know, send me a message if you want to me to change anything in the way in which I deliver these. The next session on Sunday is going to be all about William Gilpin, who was the schoolmaster at Cheam. He was also parodied as Dr. Syntax, and the person who invented modern tourism 250 years ago this year. Not that we're doing much tourism at the moment. Anyway, Sutton, thank you very much for listening. I'll say goodbye. So long, Sutton, your history.